Hi, I'm Rich Lyons. This is the Living After Faith podcast. Come laugh with us. And our guest today on Living After Faith is Sara Andrews. She's one of our listeners, someone that we've just met recently and wanted to tell her story. So, Sara, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
Tell us a little bit about your religious background itself.
My parents are very religious, and I grew up in what they called a non-denominational church, but was really a evangelical, born-again Christian church with a kind of a Protestant start. And I was pretty heavily involved in that church from about 6 to about 18.
Did you change churches? What happened when you were 18?
No, probably, I feel pretty fortunate, probably between about 16 and 18, probably started a little bit earlier, I really started questioning. And after I moved out of my parents' house, I left the church. And I did occasionally go to services with my parents for special occasions, but I eventually decided that I didn't feel comfortable doing that anymore. And for a long time, I was completely out of any religious organization. But about 2 or 3 years ago, I became a member of a Unitarian Universalist church, but I do consider myself an atheist.
How did you come out? What were the questions? Tell us about the process.
It was an extremely painful process. I was actually very religious when I was a kid. I was not someone that went to church but never really bought into it. I really did, and I really thought that this is what I was going to base my whole life on. I enjoyed going to church, and I was really, really involved. So I went to church at least 3 times a week. I was in youth group. I was in a drama group that I went to in the evenings during the week, and then I would go to all 3 services on Sunday morning. Usually I'd volunteer one, I'd teach Sunday school one, and then I'd go to the adult service for one. And in addition to doing that, I went to summer camps, week-long summer camps. I went on a mission trip in high school. So I was really kind of embedded. And so when I started questioning, it was actually pretty painful. And I did have a lot of anger, too. A lot of it stemmed from some things that happened to some people that were close to me, really traumatic things. And I was a huge reader. I've been a big reader my whole life, and I didn't just read fiction. I read nonfiction, and I also read the Bible. And reading the Bible itself actually really made me question my beliefs, especially the Old Testament. There's some pretty unpleasant things in there that they kind of glossed over.
What were some of those things that come to your memory now?
Oh, my gosh. Just some things in Deuteronomy about women, and I think you might even have alluded to it in the past, but women who had been raped had to marry their attacker. I was just like, how can this possibly be? Things that were about war, things that were about animal sacrifice were really difficult for me to accept. And I actually am pretty amazed that I was able to be so kind of critical thinking about that, because I specifically remember in one Sunday school class, one of my fellow students, I think who was also having some of the same doubts, was like, well, we don't have to believe in Genesis literally, do we? And I think that the response to that actually had a big effect. They were like, yes, you have to believe in this literally. I think my church was young earth. And I was just like, there's no way. I don't believe that at all. I know I just read too much. I was really into school. I was really into science. And I also had a couple of gay friends, and I really didn't like the church's belief about them. It was really just a huge amount of things kind of compounding. And I think the hardest thing for me is I wanted to be a Christian. I wanted to be in the faith tradition that my parents brought me up in. I wanted to believe that what my parents told me was true. And I have a close relationship with my parents still. And it's really hard. I think this all happened probably 16 years ago, and it's still really hard for me with my relationship with my parents. I think that's the one thing that's still kind of holding on, that's damaging me from Christianity. It's just having to deal with my parents and the disconnect and their belief that I'm going to hell. It's pretty painful.
I think one thing that people don't get, but you're articulating very well, and I kind of want to go into that, is you wanted to do this. I remember that myself. I didn't want to wake up one day and be an atheist. I never wanted that.
Well, at that time, I was reading Christian apologetic books. I actually went to a counselor at my church and told them that I was having doubts. And, I was really trying to stay a Christian. And I think that actually kind of held on for a long time, even kind of after I stopped believing. I always second-guessed myself, and I always kind of had this part that wanted to go back, but I just knew that I couldn't. And it actually took probably, I would say 5 to 8 years after I left to really feel comfortable with trusting my understanding of the world as it was. After I got out of the church, I started reading lots of other books. Like I read, I think probably when I was 20 or 21, I read The Selfish Gene. I read Why People Believe Weird Things by Michael Shermer. I read some Dawkins books, but this was way before the God Delusion, so they were just other books on evolution. But I also read a lot of books on cosmology and astronomy. But part of the reason why I wanted to talk to you is because I really feel this would have been so valuable for me during those first few years when I was really struggling with it and really just having a hard time trusting myself. And I think it would have been useful for me to understand there are other people that kind of went through that same process that I did.
Well, that's exactly why we are doing this, because as a minister coming out, I thought that I was the only one. I didn't realize there were other people and that they're going through, by far and large, you go through the same process of coming out, and it is a painful process.
I definitely did go through a period of depression, and I think that was caused by a couple different things, but I had based my whole life around this belief system, and I was basically told that was my reason for living. My reason for living was to be God's creation and to worship God, and that was why I was here. So when I lost that purpose, I really felt lost for a while. I was just graduating from high school and going to college. I didn't really have a good career goal, and so when I lost that one piece, I felt really lost. And I think that, had I had a different kind of reason for living growing up and not made that my only reason, and it's easy now. I have a million other reasons for living. But it took a while to get all those reasons, and not even to get the reasons, but just kind of refocus my life in a different way. And I feel like being a critical thinker and being and questioning beliefs has really helped me in a lot of other ways in my life, too. Specifically, and those things are, I am getting married this summer, and I'm really, really happy that I waited to get married. And I feel like if I would have stayed in Christianity, I probably would have gotten married in my early 20s, and I think that would have been a huge mistake. I have decided to be child-free, and I think if I would have stayed in the church, that would not have been accepted at all, and I think I would have been much less happy. And the third thing is that I'm vegan, and I feel like my mom has said a couple of times that you just want to decide what's right and wrong for yourself. And I'm like, well, that's exactly true. I do want to decide what I think is right and wrong for myself. I don't understand how you can take this moral system that you had no part in and just accept it without any critical thought. It boggles my mind. Like, the Christian God killed on purpose, millions of people in the Bible. And I don't know how that's ethical. I can't quite figure out the cognitive dissonance that people manage to practice.
Especially when the concept is he created these people himself. My bigger question, even bigger than killing them on earth, is the fact that he designed a system. I mean, if you take the Christian perspective, he designed a system going in. He knew from the get-go that billions of people were going to spend eternity in hell, and he set it up that way. It was his plan all along. He had the power to never even create a concept of hell. I mean, somewhere along the line, he thought, hey, this is a great idea to torment the vast majority of humanity forever and ever. And that, to me, is totally unconscionable. No being capable of creating this would have come up with a way of doing it that bad.
And I just think the whole idea that God gave us knowledge but doesn't expect us to use it to think about what we do and what we believe. I mean, it's so easy for me to understand that if you grow up in a Muslim country, you're going to be Muslim. If you grow up in a Jewish community, you're going to be Jewish. If you grow up in India, you're going to be Hindu. It just boggles my mind that Christians can be like, we're right and everyone else is wrong. And every religion does that. I mean, I don't know if you've ever listened to the podcast Irreligiosity, but their tagline is the one true podcast, and it's an atheist podcast. And I just love that. I love that tagline so much.
I like that a lot. I have not heard that, but I like it. My wife is the podcast listener.
I also listen to Savage Love, so I heard that she's a fan as well.
She has read Savage Love since she was 13 years old and has not missed any of that, which I owe much of our happiness to Dan Savage.
I'm a big fan. and Dan Savage talks about religious guilt a lot, and I think that was another thing that I had. Fortunately, I did not end up in the situation that you did. That sounded terrible, by the way. But, I had a lot of guilt around sexuality. It didn't quite manifest in the same way, but I couldn't imagine if I would have stayed in that system, how unhappy I would have been.
Tell us a little bit about your process coming out. What kind of things did you face once you finally made the decision, okay, I'm atheist?
I think it was pretty gradual because it had happened at a time when I was moving, and I was moving out of my parents' house. So it's quite easy for me to go from being active in the church to not being active because I left the area that I lived in. But I eventually came back to the same area, but, I grew up in kind of the big cities in Wisconsin, Milwaukee, and Madison, so there were a lot of other people around. I wasn't limited to a small group. I think actually the hardest thing that has happened recently is that when I actually became a part of the Unitarians, then my parents thought that that was a way back to their religion. They kind of grasped at straws, and they're like, oh, you're coming back to the flock. This is just the first step. And I'm like, no, it isn't. But I actually wasn't very honest with them. I didn't straight up say, hey, you know what, you can be an atheist in the Unitarian Universalist Church. They don't mind. In fact, the one I go to has like a 35% atheist congregation. But we did have an argument in a restaurant, which basically ended with me crying for several hours. So, I mean, it's not been all peaches and cream, but just the timing worked out for me. I didn't really have to deal with a fallout where no one kind of knew I was leaving.
You mentioned moving. As much as I understand people are attached to their place and attached to where they are, one of the things that I have discovered and have actually read a study on is that a large percentage of the people who do well move at least 500 miles from the place that they were, and you articulate well that was a big part for you.
Well, it's just a lot easier because you're losing the community, but you're losing it for multiple reasons. You're not losing the community, and at the time I was leaving, a lot of my friends were leaving too. I definitely feel like part of the reason I eventually decided to be a part of the Unitarians, who I didn't actually even find out about until my late 20s, is because I did miss the community. I think that when you grow up in that community and you have a place for your rituals and you have a place to talk about deep thoughts, you can really miss that type of place. But I was amazed when I found the Unitarians because it was a really great place for me to go and find that same community without having to believe in God. And I'm getting married next year, and I'm really happy that I have someone that I know to do our ceremony that's not just a judge, although I have, friends who are ordained online or whatever. It's kind of meaningful to me to do it within a community like that. And, it's not the same at all as a normal Christian church. It's not a Christian church, even though it has a Judeo-Christian beginning. There's no required tithe. I mean, my parents literally tithe 10%. It's so hard for me to deal with my parents because I know that they get comfort and happiness from being a part of it, and I know they don't want to stop believing, and I don't really want to convince them to stop, even though I think they're wrong. It's really quite hard. I don't like talking to them about it at all. The rest of my family is not evangelical. They're all Christian, but they're not quite so embedded as my parents. So it wasn't like I lost my family or anything. But my parents definitely do believe that only Christians go to heaven. I really do think they're wonderful people, which is why it's so hard for me.
Sure.
And I think they actually feel like they did something wrong. They feel like I think less of them because I think that they're wrong. Like, I'm actually making a statement about who they are because I don't agree with Christianity. I think that's how they feel. And it does kind of surprise me. And I hate to bash on my dad, but he works with DNA. He's an electrical engineer. He has a background as an electrical engineer. And it kind of boggles my mind that someone with kind of a math science mind can somehow manage to then believe things that clearly are not true.
Yeah. How can you suspend part of your belief, but cling to stuff that is so unscientific on the other hand? I mean, the literal belief in Genesis, there's no way.
Or like the flood. I mean, I just remember I read in a book called, I can't even remember, it was about math illiteracy, but I can't remember the exact title off the top of my head. But it was something like, if it was raining hard enough to cover all the land surfaces, it would have been raining hard enough to sink an aircraft carrier. The idea is just ridiculous to begin with. I mean, we're trying to make something that's a myth. We're trying to work something that's, and obviously there's people that do this for a living. Look at the Creation Museum. I don't understand it. It seems completely insane. And these were the things that I was thinking about when I was going through this transition. I'm like, really, that makes no sense at all. And dinosaurs, come on. I think if I would have been in a church where they were like, well, these are allegories, we can try to get a story out of them. They're not necessarily literally true. They probably would have hung on to me for another few years.
Let's talk about life now. Tell us how you're living now and how you've managed to be successful.
Well, I'm getting my master's degree in May in library science. I'm pretty excited about that in May. So I hope to be a librarian. I don't know if that's going to happen in this economy right away. Public jobs are thin on the ground, and our lovely governor would like to make them even thinner on the ground. But I don't know. I have a great group of friends. I've been with my significant other for 5 years, and he is also an atheist. He was not raised in religion at all. It's actually really nice to be with someone who's been atheist their entire life, because I think that he has a really interesting perspective on Christianity and kind of all religion that helps me feel confident. And I don't know, like you said, you kept yourself away from a lot of secular things when you were religious. You didn't go to movies, you didn't watch TV. When I was a Christian, I only listened to Christian music, and I almost read primarily Christian books. I really kind of walled myself into that little belief system, and I didn't want to read anything that was, secular. And, I think there's so many things in life if you open yourself up to experiencing all the world has to offer in music and art that a lot of people restrict themselves from. I've had a lot of really fantastic relationships, and my friends are pretty liberal. I, have managed to kind of surround myself with, I think, a group. I always have a hard time understanding how the vote turns out the way it is, because I don't surround myself around many people who would vote for the people I don't like. So I'm like, who voted for these people? I don't know them.
I have so enjoyed talking with you, Sarah. So can I ask you an off-topic question?
Sure. I don't know if I'll be able to answer it, but I can certainly try.
Are you a book person? Do you have an e-reader?
I don't have an e-reader. However, and get this, I'm also a bookbinder, and I do antique book restoration and conservation, so I am a hardcore book lover. However, I'm also kind of a techno junkie, and I've been listening to audiobooks on my iPod since they came out. Kind of have an addiction to podcasts and audiobooks. I listen to a lot of them. And I was just talking the other day about just kind of entertaining the possibility of getting a Kindle. I do know a lot of people in library school who have them, and I know a lot of older librarians and retired librarians, and a lot of them have Kindles too. So I don't know. I'm kind of half and half. I think that managing rights in libraries with books is going to be one of our major challenges, and probably fairly difficult to deal with. But I definitely have a very, very deep love for the physical book. So I don't know what exactly you wanted to hear, but I'm kind of split down the middle. That's
exactly what I was wanting your answer, and that's what you gave me. Our guest today has been Sara Andrews. She's from Madison, Wisconsin. This is the Living After Faith podcast. You can find us at livingafterfaith.com, also facebook.com/livingafterfaith. We're on Twitter. You can find us in all the normal social networking places. We're the official podcast of recoveringreligionist.com. That is an organization started by Dr. Darrell Ray. He is the author of The God Virus and several other books. So we're glad that you listened to us today, and we will talk to you next week. I'm Rich Lyons. Come laugh with me.